studio with our good buddy, Dr. Peter Hammond, a Frontline Fellowship, all the way in from South Africa, giving us a little bit of a history on this here nation from which you come, to tell us about Nelson Mandela, because the perception in the US of A is he's a wonderful fellow. We should love him. We should honor him just like our president does. That's the way he was portrayed in the movie Invictus with Matt Damon. It was produced and directed by Clint Eastwood. And he's Republican. He spoke at the convention, so it all must be good. You say, big thumbs down. What's the problem with Nelson Mandela and Invictus?
The question they never answered in that film or in most of the propaganda pieces, why was Mandela in prison? The impression given is because he was black, because he was against apartheid, against discrimination, he is for freedom. The man's a prisoner of conscience, but actually Amnesty International never took his case because they said he was not a political prisoner. He had had a fair trial and he had a very restrained sentence for crimes that he pleaded guilty to. 156 acts of public violence and terrorism, actually.
156.
6 public
and he
acts of
and he
violence.
pled guilty to those charges.
And he's trained as a lawyer, so he knows what that means.
Yeah.
So the context was the ANC were a terrorist group fighting a vicious war, and we had Soviet warships in our neighboring countries, Mozambique and Angola. The whole hierarchy of the Warsaw Pact were there, and they were offloading the Cuban trucks and tanks and missiles and into Angola, and Cuban troops were goose-stepping down the streets in our neighboring capitals.
Okay, what year are we talking about here?
1960s, 70s,
All right.
into the 80s. So when Carter was president, they came in. When Reagan was president, they were fighting, and we were in a very hot war. Soviet missiles in our neighboring countries. Now, you thought missiles in Cuba was a bad idea. We thought missiles in Angola and Mozambique was a bad idea for our security.
All right,
as well.
now you need, just for in ANC, what's the ANC?
African National Congress, or Abortion, Necklacing and Communism Party, or Abortion, Nepotism and Corruption Party. But they're the bad guys.
Okay, so they're the bad guys. And Nelson Mandela's relationship to them was?
He was the head of their military wing, the terrorist wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. So he was trained by Che Guevara and by the Cuban DGI in order to how to plant bombs and make car bombs and kill people.
Okay, and you use the term necklacing for people who are not hip on your terminology.
I've got some pictures of that just now. It's
great.
a form of assassination. So we've got a real threat. You'll notice Che Guevara's nice ugly mug up there on the wall. And Uncle Fidel Castro was visiting one of his latest colonies, this being Angola. There were tens of thousands of Cuban troops in 13 countries in Africa, including 60,000 Cuban troops just in Angola on our border. And they were burning, bombing, destroying, wrecking churches, putting people against the tree and shooting them without trial, landmines. We had terrorists coming across the border, doing atrocities like these, tying up people with wire and bayoneting them in the back, shooting village headmen, chiefs, murdering missionaries. I mean, this is the context of why Mandela was in prison, because we were facing a violent terrorist assault. This is Red Cross ambulance workers shot out. This man had his lips and ears cut off, and he was forced to have his wife cook and eat them. This woman had her lips cut off because she spoke out against the communists. And this is Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF who did that one. Missionaries and their kids murdered, bayoneted on the fields. Whole families killed by landmines planted in the roads. And this is what the ANC's own propaganda posters had, which was death to apartheid, long live Umkhonto we Sizwe. These are the weapons they used. And Nelson Mandela organized the plan, Operation Mabuyu, which was for these plastic explosives and landmines, as you can see in a picture here, in order to attack farmhouses, railway stations, people in public areas.
Okay, so the connection between Nelson Mandela and Cuba and Fidel Castro and Soviet Union.
Completely and utterly integrated.
So Nelson Mandela would not be considered a Democrat, a Republican, or a capitalist.
No, he was a communist. In fact,
flat out.
One of the uncontested pieces of evidence against him at his trial, the Rivonia trial, was how to be a good communist in his own handwriting, 65 pages. You can actually access it on the web in his own handwriting. And he did not contest that that was his publication. He wrote How to be a Good Communist, 65 pages of it. Look at this ANC Umkhonto we Sizwe. Now, Nelson Mandela was the head of the armed wing, the spear of the nation, called Umkhonto we Sizwe. At the 25th anniversary, what are they symbolizing? AK-47s, grenades, and a petrol bomb with an automobile tire, which symbolized the necklacing. You put an automobile tire over someone, pour petrol over them, set them alight. That is called necklacing. 1,000 people were necklaced by the ANC. That's black people burned alive by this hideous, torturous method. And here you can see the Communist Party infiltration of the ANC. The entire executive of the African National Congress was actually communists, Communist Party members. And this was proved and shown to be completely controlled and directed by the Soviet Union. This, by the way, is from evidence entered in at the US Senate hearings on the Soviet infiltration of the ANC, supervised by Senator Jeremiah Denton. And these are what the Soviets were bringing in. The thousands of tanks and artillery pieces and missiles coming into our neighboring countries. This wasn't just somebody writing a poem. We were talking about not just violent terrorism in the country, we're talking about a conventional military threat on our borders. That's the reality. Soviet flag, ham and sickle, and church members being co-opted into this. This little girl, she was burned by a suitcase bomb with fuel in it, placed in Johannesburg Central Station by Umkhonto we Sizwe, and this is something that Nelson Mandela pleaded guilty to. This is one of the 156 acts of terrorism, which people died. Her grandmother died. This girl was scarred for life. Car bombs on the streets. This is the Church Street bombing. Now, we know the IRA did this. We know that the Palestinian Liberation Organization did it, but the ANC did it too. You had a bombing in Boston a while ago, and your president said anyone who placed a bomb in a public place is a terrorist. Well, Nelson Mandela's ANC did this, but he calls him a role model. Nelson Mandela is a Marxist. He wrote the book How to Be a Good Communist, which was entered into testimony at his trial. The man is a humanist on every level. He has pushed through legalization of abortion, pornography, homosexual relationships. He put into the Constitution protection for sexual preferences. The first constitution in the world, I believe, to actually, in the Constitution itself, entrench privileges for perverts. Nelson Mandela has put forward so many things trying to legalize prostitution. He's a radical liberal and a humanist of note. And we've challenged him, and I spent an hour discussing these very matters with him when he was president, and he summoned me to his home because I just marched 30,000 people outside his offices to protest his pagan policies. So I'm astounded that so many in the West idolize Nelson Mandela and lift him up as a messianic figure because they obviously don't know what he teaches, what he believes, or what he does, or his support for some of the most radical Marxist dictatorships on the planet with some of the worst human rights records, such as the governments of Red China and Cuba. And he has supported these dictators wholeheartedly and received them to South Africa with the greatest honors. And Clint Eastwood's latest film, Invictus, which does more of this distortion of history and rewriting of reality, this has not helped either. There's a lot of Christians out there who idolize Nelson Mandela just because they've only been given false, misleading, and incomplete information. Clint Eastwood is obviously a very good director, but he chose the wrong story. Yeah. He did a good propaganda piece, but, you know, Leni Riefenstahl, she did an excellent job with Triumph of the Will on Adolf Hitler too. You know, to admire the technical brilliance of a production isn't to say you agree with the philosophy behind it. It was a well-made film, but it was such propaganda. On the Tuesday, we marched 30,000 people to Parliament to protest against Nelson Mandela's legalization of pornography, prostitution, homosexuality, and all these other evils. And that was on the Tuesday, and I was summoned to the President's home on the Thursday. And I went there, and he gave me a full hour, and he was very gracious, very charismatic. You could tell that this man is polished when it comes to handling the media and the press. And he said, we're responsive to the concerns of your constituency, and my door is always open to you. And so he was gracious and all of that. But one of the things that he said right at the beginning was, so, Mr. Hammond, what were you doing in the years of struggle? So I said, I was fighting people like you, sir. And he laughed and said, I'm so glad to meet an honest white man. He reached out and shook my hand again, laughing away. He said, All the whites I've met so far have said how they always supported me and opposed apartheid. I wondered how the National Party stayed in power for all those years when everyone supported me. So I said, well, make no mistake, Mr. President, we were not fighting for apartheid. We were fighting against communism and against terrorism. So he leaned back and he said, apartheid was the greatest evil in the history of the world. So I said, well, I cannot agree with that, Mr. President. I think that prize must go to your friends and supporters, the communists. The 20th century is littered with the corpses of 160 million people, conservative estimate. Not killed in war by foreign governments, killed in peace by their own people. I'm talking about 160 million people, civilians, murdered by secular, humanist, atheistic, Marxist regimes in the 20th century. Now, he's still silent, so I carried on. I said, that includes the 36 million people slaughtered under Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, the 68 million killed by Mao Zedong in Red China, the 2 to 3 million killed under Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And I worked my way through the Red Terror under Mengistu in Ethiopia, and Samora Machel in Mozambique, and Agostinho Neto in Angola, and went all the way through to Fidel Castro, his personal friend in Cuba. He sat there impassively, and after I catalogued this series of horror stories on the Black Book of Communism and what Alexander Solzhenitsyn and others have said about the Soviet Union and the communist carnage, he leaned backwards and stared into the ceiling, and he started to take a trip down memory lane. And he spoke about when he was a prisoner of the Boers on Robben Island. They wouldn't allow him to wear sunglasses. And he said, my eyes are very sensitive and it's very painful to go in the sun without sunglasses. I said, Mr. President, I fully understand and I can appreciate my eyes are very sensitive, and I can imagine how incredibly uncomfortable that must have been. But, sir, you must admit that hardly compares with the kind of atrocities documented by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. And, of course, Nelson Mandela had admitted in TV and radio interviews that he's never tortured. Now, there he was, a man who had admitted in open court, pleaded guilty, and remember, he was trained as a lawyer. He pleaded guilty to 156 acts of public violence and terrorism. He is the head of the revolutionary terrorist wing of the ANC, Umkhonto we Sizwe. And he was behind so many different operations, from the planting of bombs in the railway station, which killed women and children, which crippled people, bombs in shopping centers, attacks on farmers, so many acts of violence. You know, this new film Invictus, which portrays him out to be a modern saint, it never mentions why he wasn't present. But not even the Amnesty International would take his case, because they said he wasn't a political prisoner. He had had a fair trial and a reasonable sentence. He'd had his day in court. He was not a political prisoner. He is in jail for acts of violence. And I might add, in 1964, when he was sentenced, he would have been hung in Britain or electrocuted in America for the same offenses, because both Britain and America had capital punishment back in the 60s. For the crimes that he was given life imprisonment for in South Africa, he would have got the death sentence for in any other country. In fact, at the time in 1964, the South African judiciary was being praised by the most liberal newspapers like the Daily Mail worldwide for such a lenient sentence, because they knew he deserved more. And Nelson Mandela, people say, oh, Nelson Mandela is so forgiving and gracious. Well, he didn't have anything to forgive, because he had been given very fair treatment. He hadn't even been mistreated during his time in prison. It's an extraordinary thing to be a revolutionary who had violently tried to overthrow the country, that killed so many people, being head of the revolutionary group, to say that after 26 years in prison he had never been tortured. Couldn't point to any case like that. You couldn't have a prisoner anywhere in Africa. I've been a prisoner for a couple of weeks in a few communist countries. We were being tortured within the first day. It's just unheard of in any of those prisons that a person could be treated that well and survive that long. But that aside, we came back to discussing the whole issues of his policies. And Nelson Mandela was talking about racism and apartheid and how could Christians of the past have supported it. I said, Mr. President, you are questioning the Christianity of people who 40 years ago justified apartheid. But it won't be 40 years from now and people will question your humanity for legalizing abortion. You have replaced apartheid with abortion, and abortion is worse. You have replaced discrimination on the basis of race with discrimination on the basis of age. And you're not just limiting as to where this child can live or which voters' roll the child can be on. You are taking away the child's right to life. With taxpayers' money, You are legislating this child's right to life away so that the babies can be killed. This is worse than apartheid. You're separating a baby from its mother and killing the baby. History will judge you harshly, Mr. President, unless you reverse this legislation and protect the most innocent, the most helpless citizens of all, preborn babies, from the violence and the injustice of abortion. And we bounced backwards and forwards on this level for quite a while. Well, at one point, we'd been going an hour. Nelson Mandela stood up and said, "You may take your photographs now." Now, we didn't mean to be rude, and I really hadn't thought about it, but I said, "No, thank you." And his mouth dropped open, jaw gaping. He looked shocked. Maybe we were the first people that he met that didn't want to have their photographs taken with him, but that wasn't why we were there. I said, "But we would like to pray for you, Mr. President." And he said, "No, that's very private, I'd rather not." And Reverend Suan Sevenster and I pretended we hadn't heard, and we each put a hand on her shoulder and we prayed. "Lord Jesus, may you not give Mr. Mandela one moment's rest. May you not give him any peace until he does what he knows is right, and that he introduces legislation to protect preborn babies from the violence and injustice of abortion. Lord Jesus, do not let Mr. Mandela rest until he has bowed the knee to you as King Jesus and surrenders life to you." We prayed along this line. Well, when he finished, you could tell that he was probably simmering, but he was very calm on the exterior. "Thank you, Mr. Hammond. I'm always open to your concerns. My door is always open to you." Well, that was Thursday. We'd marched on Tuesday. We met him on Thursday. Monday morning, 2 senior special investigators of the Inland Revenue Service knocked on the door of our mission and began a 7-year audit of myself, my wife, all of our ministries, our mission going back 7 years, and they continued for 6 years. It was 13 years audit ultimately in the end. We had to get special tax specialist accountants to help us employ another person, and it was the most petty audit our people had ever seen. We had tax specialists say they've never in their lives seen such a petty audit and such high-level people. And our mission is a small-scale operation. In the scheme of things, we were absolutely nothing of importance, and yet they persisted, obviously because the president had set his dogs on us. So he's charming to our face, but he tried to destroy us through these tax audits. And I might add, at the end of covering 13 years, they found we didn't owe them a thing. There wasn't one thing. So all that manpower was consumed, and all they proved was our books were in order, and we were a truly tax-exempt organization that had no profit, and we'd always filed the right tax returns, and there was nothing out of order that they could point to. And that was our experience with Nelson Mandela. Charming, but he set his dogs on us.